Hello and welcome to Conversations with the Voice of Reason. I'm your host, Benjamin Boyce, and today's conversant is Mazy, who is a detransitioner. She lived life as a male for some time, or as a man for some time, after deciding that transition is how she could deal with other mental health issues. This conversation takes a swerve from the tried and true Detrans story by talking about her experience in social justice communities in Minnesota and her experience of being at ground zero of the summer of Floyd, where that unrest that swallowed the world a la Evergreen first began to take root. So this conversation is actually not just about gender, but also about social justice and about activistic thinking and how Mazy has threaded her way through such climbs. Mazy also runs a YouTube channel with music and documentaries, which are rather stellar, and I highly suggest you check those out, links to which are down there in the description. Without further ado, here is Mazy. How are you?
Good. I'm sitting in my friend's backyard and it's nice and sunny here,
Yeah.
peaceful.
Are you squatting? You're trying to take over the property? Just encroaching on.
Um, I'm I'm being a little bit free-spirited hippy dippy. That's my style. So I'm barefoot sitting on her grass in her backyard.
Oh wow. It looks beautiful.
Yeah.
What part of the states do you live in? Assuming that you do, and you don't have to dox yourself. Just what time? Just generally where you're from is kind of cultural background for you.
Yeah. Well, I certainly will try not to dox myself, but I do have a couple of public documentaries out. So I mean, I've embraced that. I'm actually from Minneapolis.
Okay.
Yeah.
Did you go to public school, private school? What was your upbringing like?
Uh, Extremely sheltered. Although, I mean, it depends on your definition of sheltered. I didn't really get to go very many places. I was just in my parents' house or at school, and I went to public school. I didn't really pay attention to school. I was kind of in my own world a lot of the time, but I did play a lot of music, and that was always a very important part of my life.
Yeah. What instruments?
Flute, viola, bassoon, piano, voice, and guitar.
Oh wow. Okay. And did you do music production too, or were you mostly band and choir?
Band and orchestra. I didn't actually start singing until I was 4 years on testosterone. It was really hard for me to sing when I was a kid.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Testosterone brought out your Lady Gaga, is that, or your Prince?
Um, well, I perceived myself as a relatively masculine straight man. I know I don't look like that now, but I passed really well as a man, and my demeanor was a lot more masculine before I detransitioned. So I wouldn't call it a Lady Gaga moment. I think it was just a strange psychological thing. I always spoke pretty low in my voice even before I transitioned, and
Hmm.
that was just like an instinct. And for most of my life, I was just more masculine in my demeanor. And um, I think there was probably some trauma at play too. I always had health issues, and I just had a lot of tension in my body. I get very locked up. So trying to sing for a long time felt very unnatural to me.
Hmm. When did the idea of becoming a man enter your head?
Uh, well, I would say consciously as a clear concept when I was 14. That's when I learned about transgenderism. But my childhood was very confusing, and I didn't really understand that I was being raised as a girl or that people believed I was a girl. So it was a very strange experience where I just naturally felt like a boy. I saw myself in other boys, and that was instinctive. And um, nobody really talked about it with me. Nobody explained that there was something wrong with my perception or that I had health issues, really anything. So I almost felt like I grew up in the Matrix. And when I was 14, I started doing research and trying to find answers on my own because I was so lost and nobody was acknowledging that anything was wrong with me.
How did you, how would you broach that topic? It's not, I could see that it wouldn't be natural for people to just talk about gender before this whole gender thing became the thing that it is. So how would you bring that up?
Yeah. Well, I remember through like various points in childhood, especially when I was younger, I would think it was a joke if somebody said I was a girl. And sometimes I would laugh about it and say, no, I'm not. I'm a boy. When I was like maybe 6 to 8. And other times, depending on the situation, I would actually get angry about it because it felt like people were mocking me and kind of making me a clown, that I was
Hmm.
otherized. Um, and especially if it came from my mom, because she was pretty aggressive about it and she would try to force things on me to try to make me more of a girl, I guess, or just I don't know. She had some pretty weird ideas about gender too, and I think that was a source of confusion in my early childhood. And she was very feminist, and I have memories of around maybe 5 or 6 years old, especially when I went to school, that I had this idea that feminism existed because some boys get to be boys and other boys are forced to be girls. So we're like second class citizens.
Huh. So your concept of boy and girl was not tied to your biology. It was tied to your behavior, your dress, your feeling or something?
Yeah, I mean, it's like a whirlwind of just a big confusing mess. Honestly,
Yeah.
I'd say when
Yeah.
biology plays a role, especially when I was very young, I had pain and there was times when I was just completely terrified or horrified by parts of my body. And I didn't necessarily have language for this, but I still remember being 4 years old and like pleading for help and just like this hurts. This is gonna kill me. I don't know what this is. I don't know what's wrong with me. And I
Like,
that
are you
didn't
talking
really
about like
go
some sort
anywhere.
of digestive issue or because that's way too early
Um,
for
I
menses?
I I don't really know what was wrong with me. That's like a whole can of worms there. It was just neglected a lot. I don't know to what degree it was psychological or physical or both, but before I really had words to explain it, I had this like convoluted image from a very young age that somebody had hurt me very severely and that I had been like cut with a knife. That was like the image I had, like something had been done wrong to me, and I
Are
didn't know how to explain that.
you're talking about your genitals?
Yeah.
Okay. So, did you have male role models in your life? A father, uncle?
Uh, Somewhat. My dad worked a lot, and I didn't really feel like I had a relationship with him until about 13. That started to change then, and we had more of a relationship. Um, he's a kind person. He's friendly. People say he's kind of a big teddy bear. But he often deferred to my mom, and she was pretty domineering, especially over me and my sister, her kids. And so, people would kind of joke that she wore the pants in the family. And I've actually noticed that with children of baby boomers, that is actually relatively common.
Hmm.
And my dad was working so much for a while, and he also had pretty serious health issues from car accidents that I just don't think he was really aware of what was happening.
Okay.
And then, yeah, things got more serious when I was a teenager because I started doing research and saying, well, if nobody's going to help me with my health issues, I'm going to do it myself.
So, what health issues are these? Like just general malaise, biological pain? You had it in your head that you and your body were at war?
That is the challenging thing I'm honestly revisiting since I detransitioned.
Okay.
I I had pain and fear and horror is how I would describe it. I had lower abdominal pain when I was growing up. Um, when I was very young, until maybe about 8 years old, I would like refuse to go to the bathroom if I had to pee, and I was just like afraid, and I thought there was something wrong with me. And I did have lower abdominal pain that would come and go, and sometimes I had like body aches. And I probably had trauma. I didn't get diagnosed with PTSD until I was 16, but I had things happen that got worse around 12. Sometimes at night, I'd wake up in the middle of the night and I'd be stuck in like a push-up position where I was like locked into it. So I had trauma that was affecting my nervous system, I think. That's what I've
Hmm.
learned, at least.
Okay. Yeah.
And then around 13, I started to get very severe lower abdominal pain. Um, and I mean, I don't even know how to describe it because I've honestly not really talked about these things
Did you
openly very much.
did your mom get you connected with a gynecologist or no? Yeah, a gynecologist.
No, um, I
Have you
I
since checked
remember,
for like endometriosis or something? Like when you start to initiate your relationship with the medical industry to transition, do they give you a thorough checkup and see what's going on with you? Or
um, they've done basic checkups, but it was pretty sparse. It was
okay.
few and far between. They didn't seem to make the connection that there could be other things wrong with me. Very briefly and rarely, a therapist would mention, "Oh, maybe you have PCOS," but nothing would really happen besides that. It was a really
Yeah.
strange experience because, maybe to simplify a little bit, this is the perspective I have as of detransitioning. Over my lifetime, I developed this construct that I thought was an understanding of my situation where I thought, oh, I'm transgender. I'm a man with this rare disorder, and that causes me pain and all of these body issues. So I thought transgenderism was causing these health issues. And now I'm kind of questioning if I got it backwards and that maybe my health issues caused my transgenderism.
Let's dig into that. So, how do you come across the idea of transgenderism? And it sounds like you think of it as a medical condition, first and foremost.
Yeah, well, when I was transgender, I thought that it was some kind of nervous system or physical disorder that maybe has a mental component or that I had a male brain. I thought it was something like that. And I had like a general understanding that maybe was not extremely detailed because it doesn't seem like other people viewed it the same way I did. They viewed it as like an identity, and I thought that was kind of weird. But
Hmm.
I came across transgenderism because when I was 14, I really wanted to figure out what was wrong with me, and I wanted to figure out why people were so convinced that I was a girl and didn't understand that my physical body looked female, but it was this horrible disorder. Like I'd been kind of left alone to suffer just on my own, and I felt
Hmm.
pretty alone in that. And I found two things when I did research at the library. I found this book about David Reimer called The Boy Who Was Raised a Girl, and he was a biological male that was a twin in Canada in the 1970s that had a botched circumcision. So then Dr. John Money got involved, and this was maybe some people have already heard of this, but they tried to raise him as a girl, so like transgender, male to female, and it was pretty torturous to him, and it was pretty damaging, and it didn't work in the end. And I related to that story when I read it. I read the whole book like in depth. I cried like multiple times when I was reading it. It like really affected me.
Hmm.
Um, but I also found the movie Boys Don't Cry. That was based on true story of a trans man, Brandon Tina, and I really related to that. And that was my introduction to transgenderism. And then I just accepted it because it felt like I finally found my condition. I finally found some explanation that would at least say, hey, you actually are a man. And otherwise, I just didn't feel like I had any evidence to prove to other people I was a man, and I just would suffer.
Hmm. So, once you were armed with that information, did it open up like a pathway to, I guess, curing your ailment? Is that what happened? And then how did you pursue that?
Um, well, I became pretty much convinced that transgenderism was the cause of my problems and that it needed to be medically treated.
Yeah.
So I started pursuing medical treatment on my own as a minor, because I had really no relationship with my mom. It was only adversarial, and that had been developing for a very long time that way. So like I didn't really go to my parents with any conviction that they would do anything for me. Maybe a little bit from my dad, and because of the negative relationship with my mom, I also just didn't have a lot of faith that my dad would do anything for me. And then once I started to get really serious about seeking medical care on my own, my dad, to some degree, stepped up. Kind of, he made an effort, but he was pretty lost about what to do and
Hmm.
confused. And then medical professionals, for the most part, so I'm old enough that I was in transition early, in the early days, like right before the whole trans wave took over. I'm consider myself one of the last like OG transgender people because I started transition in 2010. And it was still a very arduous and difficult process to get approved for transition.
Yeah.
So I had to get a therapist and go for a whole year of therapy, get a letter of recommendation, and see a second therapist at least a couple of times and get a second letter of recommendation. And
Okay.
I went through a lot of doctors and therapists, and a lot of people either would not approve me, would not affirm it in any ways, just say, well, I'm not going to give you a letter at all, or they would just make it a long, arduous process. And throughout that whole time, nobody was really investigating any possible health issues I had, that they didn't really even think to do that. They would just deny me transgender transition or make it a long process.
So the therapy, what constituted the therapy? Was it a question and answer thing? Like, was there not some level of exploration of the causes of why you thought you were a boy and wanted to fix that?
Um, I saw so many therapists and medical doctors, it's kind of ridiculous. So some of that was I would have one or two appointments and then it would hit a dead end. They would say, well, I can't actually give you this letter. I'm going to recommend you go to this place. Um,
Hmm.
or they would say, I don't think I'm the best person to treat you. So there was a lot of time kind of wasted on logistical things that I, it's kind of just a pile of mush in my mind now, honestly. But
Hmm.
besides that, if I did get further with certain therapists, and then there was this one medical doctor that actually was prepared to go through medical transition with me, and she just wanted me to get the therapist letter. So she was kind of just waiting, basically. I did one examination with her, and then she wanted me to do blood work. So she would analyze my hormones, see if there was any problems there. But most of it, she was really just waiting. She didn't really think to investigate anything else. And I don't think she was like a terrible doctor. It was just this weird situation where most people seem, it didn't even seem to occur to them to investigate further. And then for therapists, it was mostly talk therapy, which I don't think was that useful for my trauma. Um, and, they did
Did
like a
you
depression
establish,
questionnaire.
okay, like questioner, did you establish like a long-term relationship with the therapist where they got to know you, you got to know them and explore yourself and do some basic just psychological inventory?
Yes, with two therapists, at least during the time of my transition. Later on, I've had better trauma care, but during my early transition as a teenager, I established care with a therapist where, so we went to a clinic and we went to a certain therapist that I only saw once, and she was very disorganized. My dad really didn't like her, and then she refused to do anything for me, and she said, "Well, I can't affirm you," which is not necessarily a bad thing, but that was a dead end where she offered nothing else to help me. So,
Hmm.
my dad was kind of mad about the way it was handled. So this other therapist overheard it, and she offered to step in, and I started seeing her, and she said she could write me a recommendation letter for testosterone, and I saw her for 7 months, and a lot of it felt like it was going in circles and kind of a waste of time. Like she tried some mild things to help me with my fear of needles so that I could do blood work because I had such a horrible reaction to it.
Okay. Do you recall, do you remember her like exploring with you the origins of your distress with your female body?
It wasn't framed that way.
Okay.
She asked me what my sexual orientation was, and then she asked me if that had any influence on my gender identity. So it was a kind of a brief investigation into making sure that I understood the difference between gender identity and sexual orientation. Um, and for a brief period, when I was a young teenager, I said I was bisexual, but that did not last very long, and I'm pretty much exclusively attracted to women.
Okay.
Um, and so a lot of the time in therapy was spent on coping mechanisms and helping me be able to do blood work because I was so stressed out about it and it was so hard for me.
Yeah.
Um, and I don't even know if the coping mechanisms were that useful. And it was also spent on me just saying, when am I going to get testosterone? And then the weirdest thing happened, I kid you not, after 7 months of therapy, one session, she all of a sudden out of nowhere said, I can't give you testosterone. I never said I could write a recommendation letter. And I was just completely shocked because
Mm.
it went against everything we'd been talking about. So then I just walked out and I was so mad that I just never went back and I felt betrayed. I also simultaneously, by the time I was about 16, I started seeing a family therapist with my dad, and she provided some support for my transgender related issues, but also just like family issues. And she was actually a really good therapist. I thought she was much more helpful because, some people were kind of pushing us into LGBT support, and that did not feel useful to me or my dad because they focus so much on just like find your identity and find friends who accept you. And really the reality of what was happening to me is that I was going through a crisis with my family. It was almost much more a family relationship issue than
Yeah.
even a transgender issue. And this family therapist was much more prepared to help both me and my dad together.
Imagine that. Hmm. I don't want to focus exclusively on your transition to the
Mhm.
exclusion of the rest of your life. To what degree was this like your focus? What were you doing? I guess you already mentioned that you were doing music and stuff. How was your social life? What were your interests? Were you motivated, ambitious beyond this one thing that you were dealing with?
Yeah, so I think in some ways I'm kind of an unusual person. And
Join the club,
I
or
was
welcome to the club. Yeah.
and it's not like I'm trying to say that to brag because I know people want to be special these days and all that, but like I do
Fair
look
enough.
back on certain experiences and I'm like, oh my God, that's just some wild stuff. Like, okay, so I was always highly independent and I always fantasized about being independent from my family and like running away from home and being like Annie or when I was a kid, I loved the Boxcar Children. And I
Hmm.
just dreamed of like being this street kid that goes and sweeps the store and gets like food from the grocer and like this little
Yeah.
fantasy. Um, and music and writing were both these havens for me where I got to express myself. And those were two areas of life where adults actually left me alone and they didn't try to control me or just bully me or put me down. So that was a haven for me. And I got really good at both of those.
Yeah.
When I was 13, I saw the movie Into the Wild that recreated the true story of Christopher McCandless. After he graduated college, he left his entire world behind of like, you could say traditional success, the American dream, that kind of thing. And he went traveling around the country with this eventual goal of living off of the land in Alaska. And he was so kind of harebrained crazy and bold in his adventure that he ended up dying because he ate a poisonous plant that he thought was edible. But I watched that movie and I was 13 and that was like really profound. It was an unbelievable experience for me to like get this glimpse of what I felt was a sense of autonomy and liberation. And like I just became enthralled with liberating myself. I just wanted to be out in the world and not
Hmm.
feel like I was stuck in this bubble where everything around me was controlled. And the only places I went was my parents' house or school. I wasn't really allowed to go anywhere. And same thing for my sister. We weren't even allowed to bike past our own street, even though my friends used to bike to elementary school that
Yeah.
was like in the neighborhood. Um,
Hmm.
so that's like a backdrop. And when I was 14, just to share another highlight, something happened to me that I look back on retroactively as very spiritual. Um, so in more recent times, I've had this voice like in my head. It doesn't sound like crazy. It doesn't sound like it's not associated with mental health issues. It's usually associated with very powerful experiences. And this voice sounds very infinite and spiritual to me. And I've pretty much likened this to be like the voice of God. And people don't have to believe that, but that's my perception at the moment. And this voice has spoken to me like in recent times that led to my detransition. And now I retroactively go back to this moment when I was 14, and this voice like just came out of nowhere, and it felt like it like stood me still, where all of a sudden you have a moment where you're very present and like time stops. And the voice said to me, if you don't do something about this, it's going to kill you. And I felt like that was the first time anybody had acknowledged everything I was suffering.
S-
So that's what got me on the track of like researching, and I just became unrelenting, like I want to liberate myself and I want to heal.
okay. Do something. Do something. Those are two very vague things about this. What is this? Just your despair?
Um, for some reason, when it spoke to me, it felt almost multi-dimensional, like there's some kind of meaning that's instantly communicated through
Hmm.
words that may otherwise be limited. And part of it was like I instinctively knew that it was referencing my health issues. And then I eventually solidified this perception that that was referring to my transgenderism. So it's interesting to think like, this could be the voice of God, and God may have known that I was interpreting it in a particular way at the time. And I mean, it just is what it is. I guess I was on a long journey, and hypothetically, if anybody at any point in my childhood had investigated my health issues and recognized I was in crisis and pleading for help, maybe I would not have gone so deep on the transgender track.
Hmm. Could you? I guess it's getting a little ahead of the story, but how did that voice initiate your detransition?
Mm. Well, March 5th, 2023, last year,
Okay.
I had a profound spiritual experience that was like I was struck by lightning. It's the kind of thing that if I described it, it would sound like I'm on psychedelic drugs, but there were no drugs in my body at all. So I think if we look at it from a little more scientific perspective, I think something happened in my nervous system that was very cathartic. I saw a spiritual movie with a friend that I knew nothing about, and it was this like catalyst, and it made me cry like a lot.
Hmm.
And I went to like a very deep part of my body, and I was put on this whole journey. And then throughout the next few days, I was hearing this voice, and one of my friends who's very spiritual calls it the inner voice, and that's like a way that God communicates with you. And the voice at that time was saying things to me like people are suffering because they have an energetic system in their body that is completely tied up in knots, and they literally cannot perceive outside of that warped perception because it lives in their body. And it drives them to physiologically react a certain way. So when it was communicating that with me, I suppose that correlated with part of the spiritual transformation where I felt like I went to this like different dimension inside of my own body. And I felt like there was this energy structure in my body that had been formed a certain way and then was completely broken down and restructured. And that healed me beyond anything I could really comprehend. And then feelings that were quite strange. started to come up about 6 to 8 weeks later, and that culminated into this like ego death, where my male ego that had been built up for so long just like crumbled away into nothing, and I started to feel instinctively totally new things that I could only describe as being very feminine and female in nature.
Who was that male ego that got left behind? What kind of person was he?
Um, he was highly independent. He had become highly capable and responsible and strong. He became very spiritual gradually after growing up non-religious. He was in some ways a bit rigid, and in the long run, at the end of his life, was a bit traumatized from certain cultural things, especially honestly from social justice. He was very traumatized by social justice. Um,
Hmm.
he he was philosophical and wanted to be masculine but kind and creative, and wanted to have a girlfriend and be in like very close knit relationships with friends and community. And he was
Was
really
he
kind of wild and adventurous too.
was he successful at relationships?
Uh, Given how much certain things were stacked against him, I would say yes, that he put in an insane amount of effort into forming relationships. And, I'm going to speak in first person for a moment because it's going to be a little bit easier, but
Oh, totally. Yeah, yeah.
I
Thanks for
I
the
grew up in
experiment. Yeah.
I I grew up in Minneapolis, and I'm was pretty much in the heart of like a very left-wing social justice environment. Um, especially after like 2010. And there's a kind of underground culture here where people try to find others like themselves who are not going to bludgeon them to a pulp over social justice, or like be honestly just bigoted, like bigoted against men, against white people, or in some ways, social justice people are bigoted against almost everyone. That's been my experience in their own
Hmm.
unique way. And so, like, I worked very hard at forming friendships where I had a little bit of an underground culture of people that were more accepting. And among other men, as a man, I formed a kind of brotherhood where we could joke around and we were humorous and we could relax with each other and just like we had each other's backs.
Hmm. Yeah. Did anybody notice, know, or care that you were trans?
Um, in the early days, I think pretty much most people knew, and that was mostly my high school friends. And part of it's just because I transitioned in high school, and they were all supportive. I never had any issues. I was one of two transgender people in my high school of 3,000 people, so it was still not very common back then. Um, and then once so as a teenager, I moved into a transitional youth housing program because the um, the abuse in my family was really pretty bad, honestly. It was pretty horrific, and so I qualified to get into a youth housing program.
The
And
psychological abuse?
mostly, yeah, I would say so. Mostly from my mom. I don't even know to what degree she understood what she was doing, or the real
Hmm.
impact of it. That's kind of complicated. But
Hmm.
um, yeah, I haven't talked to her in 13 years. And then, I mean, to further answer your question, though, throughout in the youth housing program, people pretty much knew I was trans and they accepted it. And I went through this radical transformation. I healed in a lot of ways. I became a lot more capable. My health issues actually got better. Testosterone reduced like 80% of my pain and gave me a real drive. There's dogs barking in the background. Oh, you can't hear it. Um, so like testosterone just helped me a lot in the early days, I have to admit. And so then by
Huh.
the time I was about 20, I passed pretty well. And so after that, by about 21 or 22, it didn't really come up anymore. And I didn't really see a reason to go around announcing I was transgender. it wasn't something that organically bring up in conversation. So
Hmm.
very occasionally it would come up with closer friends or if I was talking maybe to other LGBT people.
Yeah.
And so that's about it.
What about girlfriends then?
I had my first girlfriend in high school, right when my transition started to get really serious. She was really cool. She was like whimsical and fun. She was like the popular girl among the nerds, is how I could describe her. We were both in music.
Yeah.
Um, but she eventually started dating my best friend, so that got weird. And then it was a huge mess because they went off to college, and I honestly feel like a lot of my friends in high school had breakdowns when they went to college. Like that was like a shock to their system. Um, and that's like related to some of the culture war, how it affected millennials.
Yeah.
And my then ex-girlfriend cheated on my best friend, so that was a big mess. And then I've gone on dates, here and there when I was taking it seriously. I would go on a couple of dates every few months. Um, and then I had a serious girlfriend when I was 21 to 22. And that was like, well, actually, she was a trans woman. So we were both trans. And the joke that people told was, that sounds like straight with extra steps.
Yeah. Yeah. It does sound like straight with extra steps. Was that what it was like? Straight with extra steps?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, there was a lot of absurd workarounds. Um,
Hmm.
we sort of felt like, we both struggled with this conflict with our bodies. So there
Yeah.
was a kind of a solidarity we had together, and we felt intimate because of that. And I met her after another pretty serious spiritual experience. And when I was with her, I felt like when we'd close our eyes that we had some kind of crazy connection where like I could feel both of us like in the universe. It was some hippy dippy stuff that I can't even explain, but like
Hmm.
we just had a really good connection. And in the long run, I kind of got broken down and I didn't really bother trying to date more seriously because I got kind of caught up in some pretty nasty social justice environments in my job because I worked in youth service nonprofits, and those environments were just so miserably cultish and toxic that I kind of lost my will to even bother trying to date women. And so at that point, I was probably pretty traumatized, and I
So
got a lot of pushback as a white man.
yeah, yeah, I was going to ask. So, you going stealth trans man style, you realize that you are the progenitor of all the evils in the world. As long as we, forget about the roads and the electricity and the running water and all the things that the Romans do, the white man has done nothing but terrible pain and enacted terrible social ills on everyone. You're confronted with this idea. I've been in the environment that you are speaking about. What did you do? Did you
Yeah.
internalize that? Did you let it roll off of you? Like, how do you interact with that, burden?
I've been resistant and skeptical of social justice pretty much from the most first moment that I
Hmm.
encountered it. So I experienced in high school what I would describe as maybe proto-social justice without necessarily realizing it until the language developed.
Yeah.
But my mom was basically like a second wave sort of radical feminist. I don't think she was extremely radical. I think she had her own fantasies of like being on the woman's island and I'm going to be a political lesbian. And um,
Hmm.
she was a little bit resentful of settling down with a man and having kids. So I sort of grew up around that. And my sister just kind of copied it from my mom. And so my sister just became kind of like this like activist, even though she didn't have a lot of life experience that made any sense with it.
Yeah.
We were both very sheltered. So like she'd never even had a boyfriend and she's just saying like, I don't need no man and I'm a strong, independent woman. And it was just it had a very negative effect on me when I was growing up. I think I was completely alienated by it. And I always had this like experience where I was constantly on the outside of my own culture, it felt like, um,
Huh.
constantly an outsider. And so by the time I got to high school, feminism was like this really prominent thing. And people would like lash out at me if I even asked questions or like slightly disagreed with something. I wouldn't even say anything about like criticizing women. I wouldn't even say anything that could sound sexist, and people would lash out at me. So, as social justice developed, I had this thing happen where I felt like social justice would hijack like every topic I cared about. So I volunteered with a police brutality organization in Minneapolis, and then Black Lives Matter started to hijack those issues and make it completely focused on race, and then make it like a race war, like all the white people volunteering who had, white families or victims, we're not even really allowed to acknowledge that anymore. You always have to affirm that Black people are the primary victims of this, and then maybe secondarily Native Americans. Um, and then I worked as a youth outreach worker, youth mentor in nonprofits because I lived in one of their programs. And uh, the same thing happened. They were just really very, very extreme. Definitely, like I've seen your evergreen stuff. I've seen a lot of the big scandals around these issues, and I would say my case was definitely very extreme, and I ended up being the target of a witch hunt, and I was ostracized, and I actually went public about it, and
What did you
now I
say?
actually avoid.
What did you say to get yourself witched,
um, it
hunted?
started because I took a risk to ask a woman on a date. And this is kind of an absurd risk to take in such a toxic environment. And most people, especially men, would say, if you're living as a man, why would you be such an idiot? Like you're doing this on purpose, being an idiot. And I'm like, yes, I'm aware. But like I almost felt like subconsciously my stress and resentment had built up so much that I like did something as an act of defiance,
Hmm.
and I asked a woman on a date, and I'd
You
actually become friends with her.
okay?
I thought we had a friendship at work, and she was a more private person. I thought it was going to stay between us, and that was false. And I also kind of had this feeling that sooner or later I was going to get fired no matter what. Like there's just no way I was going to survive that environment long term. White men don't survive that environment. People were trying to prevent them from even getting hired. Um, and
You're
then
not a man
people
though.
started.
You're like
Well,
a
people
trans
thought,
man. Couldn't you use that as
yeah.
like the your aegis against slings and arrows?
Well, so I really didn't want to use the victim card.
Yeah.
I was so overwhelmed by how toxic the environment was, and I was so sick of social justice and so traumatized that like I kind of got locked into my trauma, and I was really just demoralized. I was broken down, and
Hmm.
I didn't want to play their game, but then also I realized if I said I was transgender, that would open up a whole new can of worms where they had a certain narrative around LGBT stuff, trans stuff, and I had a really hard time fitting that narrative because I mostly had negative experiences living as a man. And I mostly didn't fit social justice. And I was gender conforming. Like I just lived as a straight dude. Um, I I didn't know how to be like the queer revolutionary and somehow say I hate capitalism and that makes me more queer or something. Like I was really bad at fitting in with social justice.
Just one minor detail to ask about. What did you how did you propose to this woman? And like, let's go to the Cheesecake Factory. Like, what exactly did you say to this poor lady to make her feel so overcome with male
Oh,
abuse?
oh no. Um, so I gradually had developed a friendship with her, and I did a few things that I thought would be reasonable, maybe a little subtler, to be friendly and kind of test the waters. She was confiding in me about a couple personal things um, relating to like dating and gender. And I'm not going to say details just because I've already been so public as a person. Like I feel mindful about others' privacy, even if it's anonymous, just to not make things too weird. But she did confide in me, and I tried to be of support and reflect back and stuff like that. And that was kind of part of it. And then she really liked gnomes, and I got her a little porcelain garden gnome. and it turned into this like inside joke between us. And he had a little axe, and I said, "You bring this with you if you ever." Well, we had this joke that I'm really hippy dippy and I like to hang out in the woods. And she said, "You only like to hang out in the woods if you're going to axe murder people." So we joked around about that. And then I gave her a little gnome and I said, "Here's your axe murderer, or he's going to protect you from the axe murderers."
Yeah.
So like it was that type of thing. And um, that built up to me like saying, "All right, I think maybe I can just take the leap." And I asked her out on a date. And I told her, like, no worries whether you say yes or no. I'm still going to be your coworker. I'm still going to be your friend. I have a lot of trust that we do good work together. I think we make a great team. And that was that. And she said nothing about it for 5 weeks. And then she sent me a very long email saying that I was condescending and I had male privilege. And she felt uncomfortable continuing to work with me. And we needed to have a conflict mediation with my boss present.
Okay.
And that was kind of the beginning of the end for me. And that was during COVID. And then George Floyd happened. And then everything exploded. And a bunch of people were like just saying random, vague things about me to try to be like angry. It's like they were trying to make accusations saying I was predatory towards women, um, that I showed anti-Black bias in my work. They were also accusing my friends at work. So they had guilt by association, even though they were actually racial minorities or something other than white men.
Yeah.
So it was just this whole big disaster.
Could we I want to learn more about like your relationship with testosterone and the transition as a project, but I'm also really interested seeing as how you're at ground zero of the Great Awakening. It's like I was at the Evergreen, which was like this dry run, and but you're in Minneapolis. 2020 happens, COVID happens. You're in Social Justice Central. It sounds like this thing happens, and then all of a sudden, you guys are the vector for this super spreader of social justice worldwide. Like, what was that
Yeah.
like? What was your perspective? Did you have like
Um,
your hair standing up in the back of your neck? Like, what's going on?
well, in a weird way, even though it was quite surreal between COVID into George Floyd, even though there was a surreality to it, I almost wasn't shocked because things had been getting pretty bad since like 2014.
Okay.
I really think there was a turning point culturally in local community organizations and like open mics and just like community spots in the Twin Cities around the time Philando Castile was shot, which did happen in the Twin Cities. Um, and then
What
Black
year
Lives
was
Matter
that?
got really serious. 2014.
Okay.
Yeah, and so Black Lives Matter got really serious after that here, and then they kind of took over the police brutality movement.
Mhm.
Um, and there's an odd relationship where like really good police brutality organizations keep the crazy activists at bay because they need to do real work. And that's always been this like tug of war back and forth, but somehow they survive. Um,
Hmm.
and when when COVID hit, my job was considered essential, and I was doing outreach work, going into homeless encampments and then youth programs. And we had to form relationships with like, I would go into libraries and say, "Hey, can I host an event here where we help youth apply for jobs, or we do a health clinic," stuff like that. So we would set up little resource centers and like just make sure all the organizations are as interconnected as possible for young people to get their first apartment, get into a program, maybe go to addiction treatment or crisis resources or food shelves, stuff like that. So I was doing all that work during COVID, and weird stuff was happening because they like shut down public parks. So then homeless people couldn't find clean water or bathrooms. So we were delivering water to them, and just I would meet people on the trains, and it was a pretty surreal experience. And then I started to get some problems in my work coming towards me. Um, and then George Floyd hit, and everything was completely disorienting. The early days of George Floyd, I don't think people really knew anything of what was going on. You couldn't even really identify it as social justice. I mean, it was so disorienting. We would hear sirens and helicopters like every day for 9 days almost. And then my outreach work was then like on the streets. Public transit got shut down, and I was stranded on the other side of the cities at my coworker's house. Um,
Why did they
just
shut
like
down public transit? Because of riots or something?
Yeah, and
Yeah,
that
okay.
so in the first 3 days, the National Guard was sent out, and the National Guard was very heavy-handed. So you had a problem happen where there was a lot of people who were just living their ordinary lives, or just like maybe going to a protest during the day, and then they would go home or go to work. And but the National Guard was kind of deployed widespread. And so you'd have people who weren't as involved in these events or protests that were getting like harassed by the National Guard or just feel intimidated. And so in the early days, that created this image that the government was authoritarian and cracking down on these protests. And there was a huge backlash. And I'm positive that instigated everything and made like the social justice activists almost like awoke the dragon and they went like hardcore. And
Yeah.
it was, I mean, there were hotels that were being taken over, and the activists would move in homeless people and protesters to like live in the hotels. We went to George Floyd Square at night, and the police left us alone. And people were like freaking making waffles and little waffle makers and doing like chalk art. And I mean, despite the social justice, when you were at the ground floor in these epicenters, there was a lot of people out there and they were so like nice. And it was such a diversity. So like
Yeah.
early days, I felt like a sense of home almost. And I think that was a very attractive feeling
Hmm.
for people.
Hmm.
And then eventually more long term, it faded. And then there's kind of like this rot where you see the graffiti, you see the burned buildings and abandoned places, and the people that stick around were like these kind of black nationalist biker gangs that are a little bit more hotep. So like social justice people think they're social justicey, but the biker gangs are actually more like black power with a slight conservative bent. So it's
Yeah.
ironic.
Yeah, and then kind of a little bit of misogyny, like open misogyny too. So, if I recall
Sometimes,
correctly, yeah.
sometimes yes, and that, but then sometimes there was like hotep women who are also like Beyonce Black Power too. So like it's
Okay.
a
Yeah.
whole mix.
Wow.
And
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah. What was your take on that and your take on COVID? Did you just kind of just head down, get to work, keep working?
Um, I rolled with the punches initially, and I I was kind of bewildered, and I also don't watch the news very much, so I was always late to the party with everything.
Hmm.
And by honestly about May, I was already kind of sick of COVID. I was like, all right, COVID's here. I'm gonna try to work around it. And I never took it extremely seriously. I followed the protocols to some degree. Later into COVID, I was nervous about the vaccine, and I found out I was medically exempt. Um, I have nervous
Hmm.
system issues that are probably from long-term PTSD, and sometimes I have heart palpitations. But that aside, George Floyd, I eventually came to see George Floyd as a COVID protest. So we had some conservative COVID protests in the Twin Cities in April, and some people made fun of them. And
Yeah.
then George Floyd exploded and completely took over everything. That was like only thing on people's minds. And all these people are outside wearing masks that say, I can't breathe. And I'm like, oh my God, this is like a deep psychological, spiritual thing. Like people are going through something societally here. This is deep. And then the George Floyd mural was actually quite beautiful. And it said,
Hmm.
I can finally breathe now. And I actually thought that was a remarkable thing. Even though, like, yes, I have criticisms, like, it's a
Okay.
whirlwind, and I'm
Yeah.
convinced George Floyd protests were subconsciously COVID protests.
Well, people were psyoped beyond belief, and there's no way that people who went along with all of that stuff can look back at it with any sort of honesty and not see a tremendous amount of cognitive dissonance and self-contradiction going on right then, and
Yeah.
that basically tells you that they're operating on an emotional, or as you say, spiritual level. working things
Hmm.
out. What about you brought up your medical issues and what was your body's relationship with testosterone over time? When did you get on it? You said initially it was good for you or a palliative of some sort?
Yeah, I started testosterone in December of 2012 when I was 17.
Okay.
And within 6 months, it decreased my physical lower abdominal pain, uh, and other kind of weird pains I would get by like 80%. Um, Sometimes
Hmm.
the pain was so bad when I was a teenager, my hands would get tingly. I'd feel very weak. My face would get tingly. And it almost felt like it was kind of suppressing my breathing. And eventually I actually got chronic fatigue. So I had fatigue starting at 13, kind of intermittently. And then it was pretty much chronic from like ages 16 to 25. And I
Hmm.
wasn't diagnosed until I was 21. But testosterone gave me this like really strong motivational drive. And so I had to get a job and while living in this youth program, all of us that were living there were basically pretty poor. We were young still. And so I could not keep a labor intensive job until I was on testosterone. And within a couple of months, um, I was I started a job right before I started testosterone, and that gave me the drive to actually keep going. Um, and then the pain reduction was like a miracle. That was just, I was so through the roof about that. Emotionally, I actually felt like it also stabilized me. When I was 13 and a lot of my issues got much worse or started, um, I was very emotional and very fragile. And I would sometimes, certain days, I would just cry for hours. And
Hmm.
sometimes I would feel so depleted, like the Dementors from Harry Potter just like sucked all the energy out of me from crying so much. And I had no emotion left, but I was still crying.
Hmm.
And testosterone made that stop. And I felt like almost normal and stable, and I wasn't angry all the time anymore. And then eventually, after a couple years, I kind of just stabilized, got used to it. I was very happy with the physical changes and feeling and looking more like a man because that's what I wanted back then. And I started to just feel kind of normal. Um, and then by about 21 years old to 23, I think I looked actually pretty decent. And I started to get a lot of attention from women, even though I was short, which I mean is not a positive if you want to be a man dating women.
Hmm.
But despite all of that, like when I would play music on stage, I would get a lot of positive attention and women were flirtatious with me. There's a couple of times when I was at like a bar and I played music and this drunk woman would like play with my hair and say what a great musician I was. And I was happy as a clam.
Yeah.
I was very enthusiastic. But in the very long term, I'd say very gradually, there were some negative side effects that I just treated as the nature of the beast. If you're going to be on testosterone, this is what you have to deal with. Um, so there was vaginal atrophy, and they did actually warn me of that. Um, they didn't go in depth on like describing things when I first started testosterone, but they did have a list of side effects, some of which people might like and think are positive, and others not so much. I don't think they knew the full scope of the actual long-term effects, and I'm only starting to figure that stuff out now that I've detransitioned.
Hmm.
Um, but I'd say in the last couple years, the the vaginal atrophy was a serious issue. And then when I started detransition, I had to use insertable and topical estrogen cream, and that helped. And then I also went on estrogen, and that helped. And so I had some issues with tearing and hypersensitivity. Um, so I couldn't bike for like a whole month.
Hmm.
So, by the last, like the end of my transition, I actually felt in a weird way like I had aged really rapidly. Like I had just lived a whole lifetime and I turned into this old man. And
Yeah.
then that old man just died and now I'm reborn as a woman.
Okay. Yeah. What other things did you do or want to do with regard to transition? Was the hormones enough?
Well, when I was pretty young, I researched a bunch on the surgeries and I have a very visceral reaction against needles and medical procedures and altering my body. I already felt horrified by my body, so a lot of that was quite difficult to face. And I sort of psyched myself up to feel like this was something I needed to face if I was going to get better. But that didn't necessarily last because it was such a hard thing to deal with. Um, so like I went through an arduous process to deal with even other medical treatments or like even examinations were hard for me. And so eventually I strayed away from wanting to do surgeries. However, most doctors I went to said it was medically recommended and it was the standard to get a hysterectomy within 5 years of being on testosterone
Okay.
because of risk of endometriosis and
Yeah.
other potential complications. So I had planned on doing that by default because of medical recommendation. And I also had this perception that female body parts were like this deformed part of my body and I shouldn't have it. So I needed to get that taken care of and just get it taken out almost like a tumor. Um, and so after about 5.5 years on testosterone, I had a radical hysterectomy that also removed my cervix and an oophorectomy that removed my ovaries. The oophorectomy is much less common. They actually removed my ovaries because I asked for it. I told the doctor that I wanted zero risk of ever producing estrogen again, and the idea of being pregnant horrified me, and I just felt like this body part was a tumor that did not belong in my body, and I wanted nothing to do with it ever again. And without question, they removed everything. And the weirdest part about this is that that was the easiest part of my transition. I had been well into transition by then. I was 23, 5.5 years on testosterone, and uh, the surgery was relatively quick and easy, very minimal scarring, pretty easy recovery, and then it was all over. So there was no real sign that this was a horrifying thing or that there was anything wrong or anything I should question. Um, the surgeon was very practical and very straightforward. He was one of the easiest people for me to work with as a transgender person. He
Hmm.
didn't, there was some doctors early on that would ask questions where they were like drilling me with constant questions where they wanted to check if I had an intersex condition, and that felt very weird. But
Hmm.
this surgeon for my hysterectomy was all like it was easy and normal. And since I have detransitioned, the hysterectomy and oophorectomy has caused devastating medical complications, and I am starting to go through a process of grief and shock over the damage done to me that um, I don't think any of the doctors I've been to actually knew about
Yeah.
um, or warned me about.
Yeah. So without those body parts, you now need estrogen, or your body doesn't produce it at all?
But my body doesn't produce any hormones.
Okay.
Well, I mean,
So you're like
non-sex-related hormones,
you're medically non-binary now, I guess, and after a fashion, you're
maybe.
like sexless kind of.
Yeah, well, females produce a very small amount of testosterone, and then males produce a very small amount of estrogen. So I don't produce any estrogen or testosterone. And
Hmm.
I was when I started detransition, officially June of last year, I went to an OBGYN that specializes in transgender care for trans men, and I thought that made sense for me because I'd been a trans man for a long time. The problem is that she knew about my surgeries and my medical history, and she prescribed birth control to me. And I didn't know this for 6 months, but I was on a tiny fraction of the estrogen I needed and a tiny fraction of progesterone. And 1 week of pills every month is placebo, which means it's just a sugar pill, it's nothing.
Yeah, yeah.
And so I was thrown into medically induced menopause very suddenly.
Oh,
And only in December, when I saw new doctors, did they figure I probably needed to be on a much higher dose of estrogen. So
yeah,
they gave me straight estrogen that was quadruple the dose.
yeah. Jeez Louise.
Yeah, and if I say a little bit more about that, I didn't know this, but medically induced menopause, since it happened very suddenly to me, it shocked my system and it threw me into hormonal psychosis. So by July, mid-July, this was only 6 weeks into it, I started having problems. So I had non-seizure convulsions, which I've actually had before, where at night I would fall asleep and my body would just convulse like crazy, and this would happen dozens of times. The first time the convulsions actually happened to me was 3 months after my hysterectomy. So I now retroactively believe that that surgery traumatized my body, and the convulsions would happen some of the time
Hmm.
intermittently since then.
Okay.
So the convulsions started again last year in July, and I used to go on gabapentin, that was an anticonvulsant, but this time it didn't work anymore for some reason. So I couldn't stay asleep, and then it would progress, and I would fall asleep standing up. I fell asleep backwards down the stairs. I would walk around my neighborhood late at night because I just couldn't stand the convulsions continuing to happen.
Hmm.
And then I started to have delusions and hallucinations, and my friends got really worried about me. And I was living across the country in Texas at that time, where I had some friends. And my friends back home said, "We need to get you back home, and you're going to the psych ward." So, end of August, I moved back home and I went to the psych ward, and they didn't really have clear answers yet. They needed to go through a longer diagnostic process. They got me on a low dose of an antipsychotic, which really helped me a lot.
Hmm.
And they believed that I might have hormonal psychosis, but I had a very hard time getting through the medical system to get the right care. Um, and it's been a huge mess where I tried to find a specialist OBGYN, and they kept trying to send me to transgender clinics. And when I went to a trans OBGYN, I actually saw multiple at the same clinic, and they kept treating me like I was a trans woman. So I had to sign a waiver for estrogen therapy where they crossed off more than half of it, where it would say things like, "I acknowledge that on estrogen, my testicles will shrink." And they would cross it off and they'd say, "This doesn't apply to you, we know." And it's like,
Hmm.
not only did they have all of this, like, their own construct for transgender care that didn't apply to me, they also lacked the knowledge to help me
Yeah.
medically.
Yeah.
So they finally figured out I was on way too low dose of estrogen. I was having hot flashes. I was having panic attacks. Some of the psychotic symptoms were improved with the antipsychotic, but did not completely go away. And so in December, they put me on 4 times the dose of estrogen. And by February, my symptoms had improved, but they're still not completely better. And I continue to try to find a specialist OBGYN. And finally, in April, I saw a functional medicine OBGYN, and she had a much deeper depth of knowledge. She was not a transgender specialist. She knew what it was, but she wasn't a specialist in that. And yet, she had a depth of knowledge
Hmm.
as an OBGYN for women's care, for women who have had hysterectomies and oophorectomies, for women who
Yeah.
have had cancer that has sometimes similar outcomes to me. And functional medicine means that she was interdisciplinary. So she was going to look at my gut health and brain chemistry. She was going to work with a psychiatrist in consultation where she knows how to do interdisciplinary stuff to see if my other health issues were affecting my psychosis. And
Yeah.
she thinks I need to be on progesterone and an even higher dose of estrogen. So now I've done blood work and I'm in process to get that worked out.
How's your sleep life and your mental state?
Yeah, so in mid-August, miracle of all miracles, so after the convulsions had been happening and I was just disintegrating into sand, there was one night where I slept in on this like wicker bench outside my house in my backyard
Okay.
because I was so delirious, and like hallucinations, delusions, even voices. I was hearing voices. It was just all coming at me. And I just slept outside on this bench. And I liked the feeling of being underneath the stars and by the grass and the crickets. And it felt very soothing. And I slept through the whole night and half the next day. And the convulsions just kind of went away. So I was extremely lucky that happened. Um, and so my sleep improved. And I think my sleep is okay these days, but yeah, I go through these ups and downs where sometimes if I have a bad week, I get really shaky and I get really locked up. And I think that's all just like trauma stuff in my nervous system that's exacerbated by all these health issues. Sometimes my throat gets really locked up and I like I almost gag or almost throw up. And sometimes I'll have panic attacks. The antipsychotic improved that, and I think higher estrogen improved that. But I can't do any drugs. I took weed once, kind of accidentally, or it was just kind of like I didn't think about it. And I was like panicked for hours. And
Yeah.
then the next day I was felt weird. And then at night I just got panicked. So like I'm more sensitive to all of these things.
How, are you functional? Are you able to take care of yourself? Or you rely on a support network of friends and family to help you out through this process?
Um, I have some close friends that support me. That's very lucky. I'm so appreciative of it. I was able to get a really good job in childcare where because of all the social justice stuff, and I'm basically a pariah now in my field, I've avoided that stuff and now I work in childcare
Yeah.
that's not so ideological. And it was really hard work. I went to work full time and I had not been working full time for a while. And so I've been kind of pushed to the brink of survival
Hmm.
and it's been a lot of ups and downs. Um, in December, I was hospitalized for psychosis, and my
What does
friends did
that
the best they
mean?
can to help me.
What does that mean for you?
Well, they held me in the hospital against my will because I had a psychotic break, and it subsided within the first day, which is interesting. That it doesn't last very long for me,
Hmm.
and the problem, something else I kind of forgot to mention, is that throughout the fall and especially by December. Um, I was struggling to get help from doctors where they didn't really seem to understand my condition. I was bounced around between different doctors, so there was no long-term care established, and it was escalating towards a diagnosis of schizophrenia. But by February, my symptoms were getting better with the estrogen and the antipsychotic, and a lot of people didn't really think it matched schizophrenia at all. Um,
Hmm.
that it was more dissociative, like derealization, depersonalization. Um, it just looked different. And so, and then the functional medicine doctor was also skeptical of that. And so now at this point, the psychiatrists I've seen don't think that's the case at all. And there's this crazy situation where simultaneously, doctors in trans clinics were treating me like a trans woman, and the milieu around me was starting to treat me like I was schizophrenic.
Hmm.
So I'm very lucky that I've been able to get off that track and finally on the right track because it just feels like with me and also other trans and detrans people I've talked to that we are falling through the cracks and medical systems don't know how to handle us. And most people, unless they are the exact right specialist you need, have no idea of the actual details of the damage done to us by medical transition.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. So there's the medical stuff that you're dealing with. What about your personality? You said that you went through a ego death with your trans identity. What was it like
Yeah.
discovering yourself again?
So I had the spiritual transformation March 5th, the one where I think I was changed inside out. I felt different in my body. Like after that transformation, I walked around for a month feeling like a superhero. I'd
Hmm.
wake up early naturally, waves of energy through my body. I felt really good physically, no pain, light, strong, and clear. Life looked so vibrant. Um, and then fast forward into April of last year through April and May, I started having really weird experiences that started with these dreams. And I didn't even remember the dreams at first. And then I would all of a sudden remember I had these dreams where um, it revolved around this woman in my dream who was very beautiful. And I didn't think she had anything to do with me, but there was different scenarios where like I had a friend take her in and she was homeless and this friend takes her in and like helps her. And then eventually it started to feel like the feelings and experience of this woman took over. Like I was vicariously feeling what she was feeling. And eventually she became like this persona in my head. And I'm like
Hmm.
disoriented, like, what on earth is going on? Why is there this persona in my head? And I even was like at times horrified or shocked by it. And I feel like that was the male ego that was coming into clash or contrast and was like disturbed by this experience. Um, Especially since part of it that was like what really shook me to my core, that was like the ultimate catalyst, is that I felt like I was suddenly in love with one of my friends who is a man. And my whole life, I've been attracted to women. This is the only exception. And to this day, I don't know what that means. The easy answer is to say I'm a lesbian for simplicity purposes, because I've tried to replicate this and go on dates with men since I detransitioned, and I feel nothing for them. So I don't know what that means. And
Hmm.
yeah, and so I fell in love with this friend. It's like I went overnight from feeling like we're friends, we got a brotherhood, to all of a sudden, bam, I'm in love with him. And there's this female persona in my head that's like living a romance novel from the Walgreens section. And, um,
Hmm.
so I started to do this thing where I would write, because I'm a writer. So I would embody my male ego as Jack, which was my male name, and I would write, and I would be very welcoming, accepting, and write to this woman and say, please introduce yourself. I don't know what's going on with both of us, but we both seem to be living in the same body, so we got to figure this out. And so I would talk to her and try to like draw her out, and then I would embody her and let those feelings take me over and write as her in a dialogue back and forth, which then I started to go through therapy with something called internal family systems. And I learned that this writing dialogue was very useful for internal family systems. And so eventually, this woman completely took me over, and it felt like the man I was just died. I felt like I'm dying, it's over, I'm going to surrender completely. And then I became this woman,
Hmm.
and I just started doing things. Like detransition just happened to me. I started buying women's clothing. My walk had changed. I was walking more feminine. I started feeling more feminine. I started talking to my friends and just saying this crazy thing is happening to me. So it's like I was changed overnight, is what it feels like. It's the craziest thing that's ever happened to me.
Hmm. So, what are you doing now then? What are you
Uh,
to do?
What do I do in life in general?
Yeah, I mean, well, what's your goals? What does life look like for you? It sounds like you're doing a lot of healing and trying to figure out your body and then getting back on your own feet. But what
Yeah.
does the future look like for you?
Well, so since the social justice stuff happened to me in 2019 and 2020, that completely shook up my world, and I feel like I was kind of forced to the fringe of society in a way. I've had such extreme and crazy experiences. So I feel like I've been kind of a drifter, honestly, and I've been pretty lost with everything that's happening in the world. Um, I tried to live in Texas for a while. I was close to Austin, and culturally, that was just an amazing experience that felt very healing. People were so accepting and spiritual and open, and just they were not bogged down by the militant social justice that's here in Minneapolis. It was a wonderful experience, and I wish I could have stayed there, but I moved home for health and financial reasons. Um, and I've been trying to just find projects to do. So I will post things on YouTube, and I make music. So I made a music video. That song was about my detransition. It's called Shell of a Man slash Nature of a Woman. And I have a whole music video out about that.
Hmm.
And I'm really trying to work with my friends one by one to just help us all build a better life. Because, like, we're all suffering stuff, honestly. Economically, it's really hard. Um, a lot of us will, we'll get laid off from jobs for no reason, which actually just happened to me a couple weeks ago. And so like it's economically unstable and we have health issues or addiction issues. And I'm trying to like cobble together my friends and
Hmm.
say, we're going to pick up the broken pieces of this crazy mess in this ridiculous world, and we're going to build a little community where we plant a garden, we play some music, we host people for dinner, and we're going to have a real community where we take care of each other. Almost like building a refuge for like all the lost people, because I do feel lost, and I used to be so self-directed and so on a mission. I was a youth mentor. I knew what I was doing, and now I have to start over in some way. So I also started a Discord group for trans and detrans issues, and I wanted to make it as open-ended as possible to all beliefs. So as long as you're not bullying another person or you're actually like ruthlessly bigoted, where you're attacking someone's demographic traits or their character, people can say their opinions on these issues and say, this is my real experience. And people can have different opinions, whether it's gender critical or feminist or very pro-trans or maybe coming from like an LGBT orthodoxy, whatever. We're there. And I want to say, we all have health issues. A lot of us fall through the cracks and are invisible. I believe there's an LGBT orthodoxy that is toxically positive and is covering up our real experiences. So I'm going to create a space where we can help each other find medical care,
Hmm.
problem solve, host events, discuss what we're going through, and we're going to try to do something good with it.
What's your current stance on gender affirming care, as they call it, or transgender medicine?
Um, I was never exposed to it very much directly because I transitioned like a couple years before it took off. So I don't have a lot of experience with it. I do have some experience, and when I was a youth mentor, it was clear that that was the norm. So like we had kids as young as 13 who were in the pipeline, as I would describe it, to get on blockers, and then after a couple of years of blockers, start hormones. Um, so I definitely know it's a thing. And my ex-girlfriend, who was a trans woman, back in 2016, we went to a Planned Parenthood and they were ready to sign a waiver and she was going to get hormones right then and there. I didn't even know what to think of it at the time back then. Um, at this point, from everything I've heard from people discussing, I'm very concerned that this affirmative care model has gone to an extreme of like a fast track where all they're looking at is like this unilateral view of we're going to get you through a process of medical transition as soon as possible. And that is a little bit odd to me that they don't even seem to consciously acknowledge that they're covering up social transition. Like they're skipping social transition to go to medical transition. And I actually did an interview for a documentary for Detrans people recently, and they asked me what I thought legal or medical policy changes should take place. And I'm going to be completely transparent, and this is what I said to them. I have no idea what exact policies we should make. I don't feel like an expert. In some ways, I feel like I have experience that's useful, but it's quite overwhelming to see the influx of people with all these complications, people that feel deeply transgender. It's a huge mess. And so, the only thing I can think of as a starting place is that we need to slow down and there needs to be support for parents because parents seem to be getting pushed out where they're not allowed to question anything or grieve or go through their own mental health process or try to explore all options with their child. And I think there needs to be an interdisciplinary approach where we look at trauma, especially. I went through a trauma therapy called somatic experiencing that was life changing, and that healed my chronic fatigue at 25 years old. And it got me off the gabapentin for the convulsions, and it ended the convulsions. So those only come back once in a while. So I highly support and recommend somatic experiencing, as well as I think internal family systems was also very helpful to me, and I'm going to continue both of those. So I think those should be prioritized, or maybe high-level therapists should do a interdisciplinary approach to find the right therapy first and foremost. besides that, I think people who, let's say you got parents, family surrounding a young transgender person, if I can make some social recommendations, because I know how I felt, I was extremely adamant about it. Just try a slightly hands-off approach where you don't have to be affirming. You can just maybe gently avoid gendered language, try to be very nonchalant and casual, go with the flow, where you're listening, you're open, you're not pushing them in a certain direction, but you want to be sensitive to the reality is for people like me, and especially younger people now, that if they, like by the time a parent sees their teen get into this stuff consciously, visibly, oftentimes the teenager has already developed a whole inner world. They've gotten into a culture, like I had already developed a whole inner world by the time I was 14. I was gung ho, I was really attached to it. So you need a bit of a hands-off approach so that you don't inspire the kid to be more resistant or damage the parental relationship. And so I know parents might want to push back, but um, sometimes young people who get into this can be highly sensitive. So if you can take a neutral stance where, try to get your kid to positive experiences outside of trans and LGBT culture, sports, music, all that stuff. If you can get them more diverse experiences where they're not isolated and just let them have those experiences. Um, and then I would try to find a therapist that is exploratory and a therapist that is trauma informed. Like a therapist who actually knows somatic experiencing would be amazing if they can get that. And then long term, if we improve care, I think that's what we need to go through is trauma specific therapy. And then honestly, just encouraging health and well-being, looking at diet and gut issues, exercise, sports, physical therapy to help people like me get healthier in our bodies and maybe resolve some of our pain because physical therapy, exercise, gut health, these things were life-saving for me. And I used to think that went with my transition, but now I think that it's possible I could have healed my issues with those treatments without transition.
I almost did it wrong. I was going to ask about your mommy issues, but I want to put it a little bit more fine point on it. What about the future of working through the process of what you inherited from your mother, that bond, the brokenness of that bond, and the healing through that, and to what degree do you think that that relationship has it been informative of your relationship to your body? And your change in
Mm,
relationship to your body and your gender, so called, is working through some issues that you inherited from her.
yeah. Well, I think just given how long we've been apart and how life has changed so much, that distance was really helpful to me. It was
Yeah.
very healing. Um, because things had gotten so bad by the time I was like 12. And then the rest of my teen years, it was just a
Mm.
horrible, ugly mess. Um, so distance and time was powerful. And then just me being able to evolve as a human being independently of my family and not feel like I was constantly in the shadow of my family's control. Um, and I've become a very spiritual person. And when I had my transformation and detransitioned, at this point, I've become convinced that what I experienced in this other dimension was God and that God healed me. And I'm not from a specific religion, but I explore things from Judaism, Christianity, Hinduism, and Taoism mainly. And my mom has always been Christian, which was interesting because most people around us were non-religious growing up. So she was actually an unusual person in my life for that.
Mm.
Um, and I never actually minded her Christianity. She was very private about it because she felt like it was so personal and people around us weren't religious. Um, but I mean, now that I've become spiritual and I detransitioned, I feel like that makes it easier for me to potentially reconnect with her because I didn't relate to her as a person almost at all growing up. So then we had almost no relationship, and that was quite difficult. So
Yeah.
I don't hate her. I haven't hated her for like since I moved out, like 12 years ago, honestly. I just, it didn't really occur to me to reach out because we had no relationship. And my dad has always wanted us to reconnect. And with detransition, he told my mom and my sister about it, and it was like this really big deal with them, and everyone was very emotional about it, and it's just this huge whirlwind we've been thrown into.
Hmm.
Um, and so I told my dad recently that I was willing to talk to my mom. I just don't even know what to talk about necessarily. So I guess I'll just kind of wing it and see what happens.
Yeah. Talk about the weather. Talk about George Floyd.
Oh God.
Talk about the vaccine. Just a normal American conversation.
Yeah. Well, the funny part is, my family, it always felt like they didn't really change very much, and I changed radically because I got out. My sister didn't move out until last year at 38 years old.
Oh
She's
wow.
10 years
Okay.
older than me.
Yeah.
Yeah, but in some ways, my family has changed. My dad told me that they're more conservative now, which is a mega plot twist for me because my mom used to be this like big kind of left-wing feminist.
Hmm.
But left-wing politics is so weird these days. So like the left kind
Yeah.
of left a lot of people behind.
Yeah. That's true. That's true. I feel one. I'm honored that you reached out to me. I guess you made a comment on one of my videos. Maybe you made a few comments, but you opened up in a comment field, and I'm like, oh, if you want to talk, and so I'm honored that you came on and delighted with your company, and I feel very hopeful, specifically around relationship with your mother for some reason. It seems like that
Wow.
feeling going through the process of healing, that's like the next step for you, and it feels like that
Yeah.
is just some sort of open door that you're standing on the precipice or the threshold of, and so I just want to give you encouragement to go back, to go forward, you know.
Mm, yeah. I think so. Because I mean, the thought popped in my head the last few months randomly, like that I should tell my dad I want to talk to my mom. And the only thing that's really been holding me back is that I have no idea what to talk about after not talking to her for so long, and that we only had an adversarial relationship.
Yeah.
But I have healed a lot of things very deeply. I used to be so stuck in this box because social justice kind of kept me in my trauma with how negative it affected me, and like my history with my mom being a feminist kind
Hmm.
of kept me in a box. And I moved to Texas for a year and a half, 2022 to 23, and the culture there is so much more accepting. Like one of the things that was so healing to me to be immersed in was this culture where I noticed men and women were actually friends with each other. I've always been friends with both genders, but I noticed that like between family members and at church and in social gatherings of all kinds, men and women would like hug each other and it was not a problem. They would, high five and they would joke with each other, and it wasn't a big deal,
Hmm.
and people were loving, and I I gained something from that where like I would hug all my friends, and I came back here and I said I'm bringing that culture with me. So now I hug my friends and I try to be a leader in um just having a kind of platonic intimacy develop between people as much as possible.
Yeah, that's very culturally bound. The Minnesotan, kind of like the Nordic kind of very austere kind of aesthetic has probably informed your culture in some ways, and also the social justice stuff too. Yeah, kind
Yeah,
of very hyper
it's
Protestant.
Texas people called it Minnesota ice, not Minnesota nice.
Minnesota ice, I
And
like it.
well, I mean, I realized that like this culture was the perfect incubator for social justice, honestly, because people are too polite and resistant and avoidant to ever confront social justice. So they're like very flaky. At face value, they act like they go along with things,
Yeah.
or they may be interested in something, and then they are just really flaky.
Or their empathy is being pulled upon and then used to manipulate them into the opposite of connection and healing on a societal level, at least.
Yeah, yeah. Well, when George Floyd was happening, I did a lot of my work in historically black neighborhoods, and those neighborhoods are not really taken over by social justice. They have their own culture that like social justice people like to think they can just take, and it's a weird dynamic. But like all of these social justice people um, were coming in and to these black neighborhoods, and they were putting up these tents where you could kneel on a little pillow and you could pray for 8 minutes and however many seconds that George Floyd had a knee on his neck.
Yeah.
And that felt almost disrespectful to George Floyd to me because it was almost like perverse. It felt very weird.
Well, I mean, and it also reduces this community to worshiping a not exactly the paragon of decency and healthy living. I mean, George Floyd's life is not exactly that of a saint. And then to make him the saint of these communities, it doesn't seem like they would have volunteered if they were given the choice him to be the one that everybody prays to. There's just some weird twisted stuff going on there that only white liberals
Yeah.
could really pull off. Sorry, white
Well,
liberals.
I mean, the irony is that social justice people created behavioral standards so that we now actually have something in white people to make fun of, like as Karens. I think the whole
Mm,
Karen meme is actually kind of making fun of social justice behavior.
yeah, yeah. No, I mean, Karen gained a lot of prevalence in 2020. Actually, I remember that. That's when it kind of like the OK Boomer thing, and then the Karen thing, along with the black. What a fancy time to be alive, huh?
Yeah, it's really strange. I honestly have a very absurd sense of humor now, and that's how I enjoy life, and it restores my sanity. But like,
Yeah,
um, I just remember like I wanted to make a little cartoon, like these cartoons of frogs in makeup and put them all over a t-shirt with little protest signs, and it would be the gay frogs that Alex Jones is talking about.
not the Pepes, the gay frogs. Yeah.
Yeah, these are the frogs that are approved by the LGBT community.
So you mentioned that you're doing some stuff on YouTube. Do you have a project? Do you think that you'll focus a little bit this summer on something, writing, memoir, or something like that, or just music?
Well, I just finished a documentary on my channel called Touching the Source, and that is about my spiritual transformation that a little bit touches on detransition, mostly as it relates to the spiritual side of it.
Okay.
I have another documentary on my channel about the social justice stuff that, like the cult I was in and how it kind of came after me. And I have some music videos out. I have a crap ton of music that I'm
Hmm.
producing, but that is a slow process. It's like
Yeah.
my producer can finish one song a month. So I'm
Yeah.
going to continually release stuff. Um,
Can you
I'm,
send me something to close out the show with, so the people, my audience, can hear you?
yeah, I could send you my music video for my detransition, Shell of a Man slash Nature of a Woman.
Yeah. We'll talk about that after the show. But yeah, I'd like to close it
Okay.
out. And maybe have you sent your mom your work? I mean, that's a good way
No,
to.
I haven't talked to her in 13 years.
Yeah, but I was just saying, if you haven't spoken, maybe this will give her some insight into what there is to talk about. Because you said you don't know what to talk about, but
Yeah.
you're quite open and sherry, so I can't imagine you having a hard time talking with many people.
I'm open to a fault. I've trained myself to be mindful of privacy when necessary,
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
'cause especially if you're going to be on the internet. But
yeah,
yeah, I mean, I don't know. I as for other projects, I think I'm building up the trans and detrans Discord support
yeah,
group
yeah.
too. And I don't know yet. We'll see what happens.
Okay. Do you want that linked in the description, or
Yeah,
available on
yeah.
request? What do you prefer?
No, you can link it. I
Okay.
listed it on
Yeah.
Discord, which publicly lists it.
Yeah. Okay.
Um, and you don't have to be trans or detrans to join. So if there's medical professionals or parents or concerned citizens that
Hmm.
want to peruse these issues in an open-ended forum, that's the spot.
Sweet. Well, Mazy, thank you so much for your sunny afternoon, for visiting my channel, for
Hmm.
opening up about your wonderful story. And I'm excited personally to go and look at your documentaries, and I know my audience will too. So I'll link all that down in the description for them to find you by.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Cool. That's the show.